Welcome to another segment of Lore You Should Know. I am Greg Tito and I'm joined by Mr. Chris Perkins. Hello.
Hello.
Today, in this segment where we like to go into little bits of Dungeons and Dragons lore for use within your game, or just because it's really fun to know all this stuff, we are going to go through the mists into Barovia, a domain of dread, and talk a little bit about its lands and how it was devised, but also some stuff you'll need to know if you're going to be running Curse of Strahd Revamped, which comes out on October 20th. So, Chris, Barovia started as just one castle in its creative genesis. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, the original Ravenloft predated anything that was written about the idea of domains of dread. Domains of dread did not exist at that time. So Ravenloft was just this land called Barovia, which was a small, lap of land with a castle in the center and a small village at its base. That was Barovia.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even cordoned off by mists or anything. It was just, here is a land like, Transylvania or Romania or any other place you can actually visit that you can just plop into your own game. The thing, of course, is Barovia has a very strong Transylvanian, Eastern European flair.
Yeah, taking the Dracula and all of those Gothic horror tales as jumping off points for inspiration.
Exactly, but it wasn't back then in its original form this cordoned off domain that you could only get to, by traveling through the mists.
Was it even placed in a D&D setting, or was it very just setting agnostic?
It was setting agnostic, so it was meant you could just drop it into wherever it was thematically appropriate for your own campaign.
So then what was the idea behind creating what we now refer to as domains of dread, so that they kind of separated?
I'm glad you asked. Yeah. So in the TSR era, Ravenloft was so well received. There seemed to be such an appetite for Gothic horror, both in the community and at TSR itself, that it was decided that Ravenloft would not just be the name of the castle, but the name of an entire campaign setting. And as you know, second edition was big into campaign settings and creating new ones. And Ravenloft was one of the first that kind of got away from the idea of a campaign setting as a normal world, like a normal medieval world. This was a real opportunity to redefine what a campaign setting could mean. And so out of that came this idea of Ravenloft is sort of the banner name we give to the campaign setting that represents all of these Barovia-like places, and making each of them their own standalone pieces. It's kind of weird because when you think about it, Ravenloft is not a contiguous campaign. What it is, it's a collection or assemblage of a bunch of micro campaigns that are all separated from each other and unified only by the theme of horror. And in fact, it wasn't even until you got deeper into the Ravenloft line that you could sort of march from one domain to another, that there were technically borders that could be crossed. So you could go from Barovia into Lamordia or Mordenshire or one of these other domains that were created. So Ravenloft was an opportunity at TSR for every designer to sort of create their own domain in a way. And there was seen as like no limit to the number of domains of dread that could fall under the Ravenloft banner. The only thing you needed was some touchstone that people could relate to, whether it was like zombie films or The Mummy, or Ghost Pirate Ship. If you could identify a touchstone that had a horror, had horror at its core, you could build an entire domain around it. But of course, the classic domain of dread, the original, is Barovia. And in second edition, it changed from being this lap of land that isn't cut off by mists into its own mist-shrouded realm, with Strahd, the vampire, trapped at the center of it.
That makes sense. And so when you were returning to Curse of Strahd and writing that up, you had the chance to be able to flesh out what that lap of land transformed into.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of to push the mists back and show a little bit more of the area around the castle. And that had been previously done in second edition as well. There were efforts to try to explain that there was more in Barovia than just the castle and the village. But when the group of us who were sort of tackling Curse of Strahd conceptually sat down with Tracy and Laura to have conversations, it was very important that the Barovia we show felt like a true extension of what they had originally envisioned.
From the I6,
yeah,
16
from the
pages.
I6, yeah. So it was very important that we start there and use that as our base and not try to bring in a bunch of the other stuff that may have been created without Tracy and Laura's oversight.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we go on, how big in roughly square miles do you think Barovia is? Like, does it feel like, the size of Texas? Is it the size of Connecticut?
Oh, it's not that it's not as big as a state. I would say, looking at the map, that it's about. Oh, bless you. Like, it's probably about maybe 30 miles across.
Okay. So, the like a metropolitan area, like around one major city with a few villages around it.
Yeah, but as you can imagine, 30 miles is a considerable distance when people are basically accustomed to moving around just on foot.
Yes.
Or on horseback. It's in the day and age, in medieval times, if you moved more than 30 miles away from your homestead, you were considered an explorer.
Yeah. Right. I always think of that quote from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, where like, if I take one more step, I'm further away from home than I've ever been. And
right. Yes.
That would happen like this very often.
And so you can do a lot in 30 miles of space and drop a lot of interesting sites there. And so, I mean, the key with Curse of Strahd is even with the expanded page count, there's still a finite amount of space. And so some decisions had to be made about, okay, how many locations can we do? What should those locations be? How complex are each of those locations? And which ones can we fit? And which ones do we have to leave behind?
Yeah. So you winnow down that list, but then what are some of the highlights there that people should be aware of?
So it was important that, or we felt at the time it was important that we have more than one village or settlement in order for it to feel like a province or something that felt provincial.
Yeah.
That there would be a couple settlements that the characters could move between. And then thematically, we could make those settlements very distinct from each other by giving them problems that felt very unique and had a certain flavor of horror to them, so that the village of Barovia feels very different from the town of Vallaki, which feels very different from the village of Kresk, which is sort of further deeper back in the mountains. And then we threw in a ruined town, essentially a town that did not survive Strahd's depredations. And it's sort of this haunted ruin of a town called Berez. And those four sort of survived. And then everything else is more like an adventure location, like the old windmill on the windswept crag, or the spooky crumbling bridge that spans the icy chasm in the mountains, or the vineyard where the Wizards of Wine winery is, which was important because we were talking about, how do Barovians survive or get by? How do they cope with the day-to-day misery of being sort of trapped in this domain? And
it's not too different from being trapped in our domain of dread that we're in right now.
Yeah, a little bit. It's like, okay, what am I going to lean on in these hard times? And it's like, well, with Barovians, it might very well be wine. That wine is a coping mechanism that helps them endure, and so that became an important element of the landscape.
Now, were these towns there before Strahd's influence, or and the people within them, or were they, once this became a place that you can only visit by traveling through the mists, were they grown from there?
So the idea is that when Strahd first came to this domain, because he basically conquered it. He before he became a vampire, he was basically a warlord and was going through and eradicating his enemies. And then he came to this land and was so sort of struck by its beauty and its seclusion that he said, this is where I'm going to build my castle. And we presume that these settlements, maybe not the village of Barovia, because that probably grew up around the castle to an extent, but the other settlements probably existed and he just took them over. But they would have transformed quite a bit in the conquest, because one of the things Strahd was very fond of doing was not only conquering a people but forcibly relocating them. So he would move people that he had previously conquered into places that he had newly conquered in order to sort of well and truly establish now that these places were his and that he could do what he wanted with them.
I see.
And so I think you would have seen a lot of people flee these towns and then a lot of people take them over. But most of the people, I suspect, who grew to live in Barovia under Strahd's rule probably came with him or came after him and settled there. But the structures that they were inhabiting, some of them would have pre-existed the invasion.
Got it. Now, are people in Barovia people, or are they trapped souls? Are they, how should a dungeon master approach this when trying?
That is a very good question, because this is not something that Tracy and Laura had to wrestle with in the original, because Barovia was just a land.
Yeah.
It wasn't separated. They were just people. But when, with the idea that this is a domain of dread and it's cut off from the rest of the world, there's a finite number of people there. Eventually, that's going to it's just going to dwindle down to nothing, unless they're very precocious sexually, which they probably wouldn't be under the circumstances. But
there is the wine. Maybe the wine helps.
Yeah, there is the wine would help. The wine would certainly help. But what we decided on, what we thought would be creepy, is that because in Dracula, the Bram Stoker novel, there is this recurring theme of resurrection, that people get basically reborn into new bodies, but they're kind of the same people.
Yeah.
Like Dracula's wife, and then the woman he pursues, he sees his wife in her, basically. That because resurrection and rebirth are sort of part of the Dracula motif, that we would incorporate in the story by saying that souls. So when a Barovian dies and their soul takes flight to go to the afterlife, it doesn't get through the mists. It gets sort of steered back and sort of snared and funneled back into a new birth. So when a child is born in Barovia, it actually contains an old soul that is just constantly being recycled over and over and over and over again. And then we also presumed that not everybody in Barovia actually has a soul, that some of the people in Barovia are merely shells, projections created by the domain of dread to create the illusion of a living, breathing society or ecosystem. And so there are some people who, when they die, they just don't come back. And that helped us in a number of ways, because we can have imagery in the adventure of, here is Tatiana, Strahd's true love. Here is Irina Kolyana, who looks just like her. It's the same soul recycling through new bodies. But then there are other characters that just die and disappear and never return. And we just say, oh, those are the shells. Those are the fake people, the people who don't know that they're not really people.
That's almost like creepier, thinking of Barovia as this snow globe trap.
Yes.
That souls can sometimes come and get out of, maybe, but mostly
Yeah.
are
And then
doomed
visually,
to live there.
one of the things that was important too was that when we show Barovians who don't have souls, their faces look lifeless. That there's no spark in their eyes. They've just sort of got these dead expressions. And so if you meet a Barovian, you may not be able to tell if they have a soul right away, but there's something there that betrays the fact that they're truly just sort of soulless husks, parading through the daily routine without any love, passion, or desire really to do anything.
Ugh, I don't know what's more horrific.
Right? Yeah. And not knowing, I think, is part of it.
And it's really interesting to set this up as a dungeon master that the player characters are outsiders, that they're coming into this with no knowledge necessarily of what's what we're just talking about here, but they'll discover it along the way and how those creepy things manifest themselves.
Precisely. There's also the potential for a very bittersweet moment at the end where if you destroy Strahd and you free Barovia from the mists, that a bunch of people just fade away.
In like a Avengers Infinity War kind
sort
of way.
They just sort of ashes blow away like, oh my God, those people we were trying to help weren't actually real.
I love that.
Yeah.
Did you do a good thing just then or not?
Right?
Yeah.
Like you can't tell, their life wasn't happy, but at least they had life.
Yeah.
Now they just cease to exist.
Wow. All right. Well, all of the fun moral quandaries, as well as horror themes that you just brought to light in a way for people who are going to be picking up Curse of Strahd Revamped, hopefully playing it around this Halloween time. Thank you for all that. I feel creeped out, but also excited to run something. So that's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to go get some of my Wizards of Wine, juice and get into reading Curse of Strahd. Thanks, Chris, for coming through. If people have any questions for how to potentially run this campaign or just want to show you some cool art they made, what's the best way that they can do so?
I am on Twitter at Chris Perkins DND.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again, Chris, and we'll be back with some more fun stuff next week.